Greetings, my Groveling Ghouls. So I wanted to make a part 2 here to go more in depth about sideboarding and kind of the strategy changes you have to make along with the card changes that you have to make, and give you some leeway and suggestions as to maybe how to tune your own Levia build to your local meta, depending on what you have around you. Because for me personally, I've got this tuned up to how I like it, but that doesn't mean that it's representative of how every Levia deck should be. So the way I want to break this down, I want to show off my current sideboard and then walk you through every hero and what I'm going to do versus them. So just to give you the overview, we have the Tunic, Null Rune, a Remembrance, 3 Fate Foreseen, 3 Pummels, 3 Shadow Puppetry, and 2 Unmovable. So we're going to put these to the side for a second. And then just walk through matchups and what I would do versus each of them. So versus Katsu. Katsu is a hero that I really don't like to face. I think he's quite oppressive because if you don't block him correctly, he's going to be threatening much more damage than what your deck can realistically do, even on like an insane Blood Rush turn. If you just don't block out Katsu, he can go even above and beyond that. So versus Katsu, I want to take 3 Fate Foreseen. I want to do this because I just need better options to block all of his relevant attacks. And Fate Foreseen lets me cover up some really good breakpoints, like if he's got Whelming Gustwave coming in for 4 or something like that. Fate Foreseen can block that out for just 1 card. I don't have to sacrifice equipment or 2 cards from hand to do so. So when I put in the Fate Foreseen, I take out cards that don't block well. So I would take out 2 Howl and the Eye of Ophidia in this case, because these are all cards that don't block very well, especially blocking 2 is just not relevant. And the Fate Foreseens give you the opt that the Eye of Ophidia is kind of also doing for your deck. So these just don't need to be here in that matchup versus Katsu. I will say Katsu is not looking too hot in this new meta, so I'm pretty happy about that, because Katsu in the hands of a really good player is just not something you want to see. It is very oppressive, and they will punish you for the first wrong block you make. So for now, goodbye Katsu. I'm pretty happy about that. Next, we've got Rhinar. So Rhinar's not one that I have too much experience into, but versus Rhinar, really what you want is just a consistent deck, because he's going to be intimidating and interrupting your game plan. So you don't want cards that are only good for blocking, because if you get them intimidated away, then what is your deck really doing? So versus Rhinar, I would actually just take my same core 60 that I showed off in the main video. I wouldn't really touch anything, although if you know it's a really aggressive Rhinar, then perhaps you could come in with the Fate Foreseens over that same like non-block package that we saw before with the Howls and the Eye of Ophidia. If you know it's a very control-heavy Rhinar, then perhaps you could instead go for a Remembrance in the deck over a Ghostly Visit. Because if it is a control Rhinar, then you will see your deck a entire time through, which means you don't need 2 Ghostly Visits, because once you've found the 1 in your deck, that's good enough. It just sits there. The other consideration might be that if it is a control Rhinar, that you do take the Tunic. And if you take the Tunic, then you also take the Pummels, because you just want better ways to force through damage as efficiently and as aggressively as possible. And if you are taking the Pummels, then I would probably drop the, where do we have it? The Pulpings. Pulpings get less good the more non-6s you have in your deck, and they can also interrupt your game plan versus those control decks, because if Rhinar does have like a Springboard Somersault and Arsenal or something like that, then your Pulping's just not going to have go again, and that feels pretty bad. So you never really know what your opponent's on, if the hero can kind of split between a couple different playstyles. But if you're at a tournament and had the chance to scout out your opponents, then yeah, I would definitely do so, because it changes a lot as to what you're going to do. Next, we've got Bravo. Now, Bravo is a hero I never am happy to see, because they can play in just so many different ways. They can be very aggressive, they can be very defensive, they can just try to fatigue you. or they can just, rip Crippling Crushes back to back to back against you. So to kind of hedge my bets against all the different ways that Bravo might be playing, what I do in this matchup is I want to take out the Pulpings in place of the Shadow Puppetry. And the reason to do this is because kind of the same thing I mentioned before, where if they have the defense reaction in Arsenal, then your Pulping is just not getting the go again value, and it's going to interrupt your turn. Because if you planned to play Pulping into something that's going to turn off Blood Debt, and then they play the defense reaction, and all of a sudden Pulping doesn't gain go again, feels really bad. So taking them out in place of the Shadow Puppetry means that you're hoping they're a bit of a slower build, because Shadow Puppetry is very card intensive to use. You need to play Shadow Puppetry, you need to pitch a card, play a card, and then probably pitch a card, play a card, which is 5 cards just to get a go again and +1 value off Shadow Puppetry. So in those fatigue playstyles, the more defensive playstyles, Shadow Puppetry is still worth it though. But if you make the wrong call, he's an aggressive build, you are going to recredit because they don't block well either. The other part of playing the Shadow Puppetries that I really like is once again putting in the Remembrance over the Ghostly Visit. That's because the Remembrance can shuffle in these action cards from your graveyard, right? And while you want to pretend that it's always Blood Rush, being able to shuffle in Shadow Puppetry is really good too, because Shadow Puppetries are non-6, so pulling these out back into your deck is going to help the dilution of your graveyard and make it more concentrated to just be 6s and not whiff on turning off Blood Debt. Once again, if it does go long, you just don't need the Ghostly Visit, right? If you know it's a more aggressive Bravo, then best of luck, because they can just high roll you and there's not much you can do about it. But if it is a more aggressive Bravo, then I would run 2 Unmovable, probably in place of the Howl from Beyonds. Because if it is aggressive, then they're not going to go for this crazy late game value plan. They're just going to try to kill you. And so having the 2 Unmovable in over the 2 Howl means that you at least have a way to try to stop their big crush effects. But once again, you kind of have to know which playstyle they're going for, which can be a little tricky. Overall, I just don't like seeing Bravo. It's definitely winnable in both of those versions, but the fact that you just don't know which way they're going to play makes it a little risky. Then the next matchup is Dorinthea. Dorinthea, personally, I really like playing against Dorinthea because she fits the whole idea of I'm going to overblock for the beginning of the game really well. You like to do that in Levia because then you're filling up your graveyard quite comfortably and get to this point where you can put on enough pressure, she doesn't have any Dawnblade counters, that she completely falls apart. So versus Dorinthea, I'm always taking the Unmovables instead of those Howls, because the game's not going to go super long, she's not going to fatigue you, and you just need those ways to fully block out everything she's trying to do with her Repostrators and everything like that. So the other thing to potentially do if you're not as good against Dorinthea is perhaps you want to run the Fate Foreseens over the Pulpings. So the Fate Foreseens obviously are a block 4, whereas the Pulping are a block 0. So if you're less comfortable in that matchup, I'd probably sub those out as well, because you just want extra ways to block out, and if you've done it incorrectly and they try to push a riposte thing over the top, then at least you have the Fate Foreseen. But I think for me, I would just run the Unmovables and Howls. Alright, so now on to the Arcane Rising heroes. So Azalea. Azalea, I know people were a little scared of in the Chane meta because she had Sleep Dart, which was equally as good against Levia as it was... Actually, better against Levia than it was Chane. This idea that you could just, make Levia take like 15 blood debt or whatever it is. Honestly, Azalea, to me, there's someone locally who plays her. I've never had any trouble against it. But once again, the game's not going to go super long, so I would go for the Fates over the Howl and the Eye, just because you do want a little extra protection against her good arrow stuff, and the game's not going to go that late, so you just don't need the Howls. But overall, I don't think that matchup's very hard. The other beauty in that matchup is that you have Carrion Husk, which can just destroy Azalea because she's already not great at blocking, and then she has to go for some big turn, and then you just play the Carrion Husk, and she's incredibly sad that she's done no damage, got no hit effect, and you kept her whole hand and get to crush her. So next is Dash. Now, Dash is another one that can play in a bunch of different ways. You've got the control dash, you've got the mid-range dash, you've got full aggro dash, and I used to run Arg Smash against all versions of that, but realized that you really didn't need it. So currently against Dash, I would honestly touch nothing. I think I would just run the deck as it is versus Dash, because you're never quite sure which version they're running, and against any of the versions, you're probably just going to put enough aggression on them and catch them at an awkward turn where they have an item that they're just going to fall apart. But if you wanted to hedge your bets a little bit, then you could probably put in the Remembrance over the Ghostly just in case it is like a really go late dash, and you could go the Shadow Puppetries over the Pulping for the same reason that, you know, if it is a more defensive deck and they're running the defense reactions, you just don't want Pulping to be turned off. So that's something you could do. Then next hero here, we've got Viserai. So Viserai, of course, you take the Null Rune Hood. In this matchup, you take the Null Rune Hood, and then you probably... There it is. You take the Null Rune Hood, you probably take Tunic, although this can bite you. If it is a more mid-range Viserai, then perhaps this should be Carrion Husk, so that's on you to make the call for. But if you're sure that it's more of a Sonata build, then I would go Tunic with the Pummels. Pummels are going to go in over the... where it is. They're going to go in over this package because you're not going late. You're trying to be super aggressive. So you can just trim these down, go really aggressive with the Pummels and the Tunic. However, if it is a more mid-range Viserai, then I would keep in the Carrion Husk, still switch to Null Rune Hood, and instead just kind of run the deck as is. If you're really worried about how aggressive it is, you could put in the Fate for Scenes, but I think your deck just kind of wins that like aggressive race. Even if they do build up some big Rune Chant turn, it's probably not going to be better than your Blood Rush turn. So that's Viserai. And then Kano, I actually don't know. I've never played against a Kano in Classic Construct. It's the only hero I have zero experience against. But I'm pretty sure that your deck just crushes his life total. I mean, on a Blood Rush turn, you can threaten 20 plus damage, and he only has 30 life. So pretty sure you're okay there. I think obviously you take the Tunic instead of Carrion Husk, because, you know, what are you going to block with it unless you are really scared of that Nourishing Emptiness, I guess. But I would actually not even run the Null Rune, because the Hope Merchant's Hood is going to be that good in ensuring that you never miss like a super aggressive turn. So yeah, that's kind of... So then on to the Monarch heroes. These are some of my favorite matchups to play, honestly. We've got Prism. Prism is such a fun matchup to play against. You never really know what build they're going, but you can almost always safely play the Tunic because the game's going to go relatively long. And with the Tunic, of course, you play the Pummels. The Pummels I would put in over the Pulpings. And that might be it, honestly. You don't want to take out the Howls in case the game goes super late. The Remembrance could be good, but then again, you don't want to hedge your bets too much that it's going to super late. But really what you want to do by taking out the Pulpings is make sure that you're playing around the fact that they probably run defense reactions, the fact that Pulping can't pop Phantasm, and the fact that you just do need to take out something for the Pummels. This just works really well. Prism honestly comes down a lot to player skill and how you navigate that matchup, but one of my favorite strategies versus Prism is to just let them, you know, spend their resources on something, right? They can't just make shields for doing nothing. They have to start swinging with heralds, just pop them. If they play any auras, then, block out with whatever, swing claws, pop them. And just kind of wait until you've counted a certain amount of their deck away, tracking the merciful retributions or whatever it is. Or maybe you just draw into an insane blood rush hand and use that as the pivot point. Versus Prism, you also really want to be careful with scab skins. Do not roll them for greedy reasons. Just try to always play your hand as if you didn't have access to scab skins, because you need to save scab skins and gambler's gloves for when they play Arclight. So that's really the tip in that matchup. But really, this is a fun one to play. If you have a friend who plays Prism, grind out that matchup. You should win. Levia is favored, but it is a blast to play. And then actually one cool interaction, I want to show you this in this matchup. So Blasmafet, right, has this amazing ability where once per turn, cost 0, you can attack. So the way this works versus Prism is that they can respond just to the attack declaration, not the triggered ability that lets you banish and then banish their soul. So if you're versus Prism and you declare an attack with Blasmafet at Prism, and they decide not to respond, then you can banish a card from hand to banish a soul, and they'll lose a life. They cannot respond to that. They can only respond to the attack declaration itself, which is pretty nifty, because they don't get to last minute change their mind and say, oh, well, hold on a second, I do want to make a shield here. But in all honesty, if they make a shield, it's almost okay, because they've now used an entire card in hand to just block 1 life, whereas they perhaps could have used that card to block 3 life when you swing with this thing. But, different scenarios arise, like maybe it was a aura that they pitched. You never know. But anyway, cool little interaction. Then next we've got Chane. Chane, I haven't played too much against him in the new meta, especially after his bannings. But I do think it has to be favored for you, because it was already favored in the previous build. And now he is just weaker, right? He just doesn't have the same insane access to seeds that he did before. But I still would respect it, and obviously acknowledge the fact that the game is not going late. So I would still take the Fate for Scenes in over the Howl and Eye package. Yeah, and there's a chance that the new builds are maybe very null rune or very arcane damage heavy, and you might have to take the null rune, but normally I just wouldn't take the null rune head. And then next we've got the mirror match. I really hate mirror matches in this game, because I feel like, especially if you're on the same strategy, it just kind of does come down to draws, or some lucky variants. And Levia in particular is a hero that is super susceptible to variants. In this matchup, I would just be very patient. Try to be slower than your opponent, because if you can block out more of their power cards and keep more of your power cards to eventually play into them when they are more at risk of taking blood debt, you will win the matchup. But that's really the best you can do, and same deal, you just want good value block cards. So I would just take the Fate for Scenes over these, and yeah, that's that. Then we've got the last Monarch hero with Sir Boltyn. Boltyn is really fun to play against, honestly. I think the Raiden build is one of the most even matchups there can be. It's very 50-50, but I do think it's favored for Levia just because your Soul Harvest and Doomsday actually have beneficial benefits for playing against Soul heroes, whereas he doesn't have anything that's beneficial to play against Shadow heroes. So I think that's where the little edge comes in your way. But otherwise, this matchup's very even, because a lot of your non-attack action cards that you want to block with end up being blues, which is a little awkward, and they're also non-6s. So in this matchup, once again, you do just want better blocking options, so you go for the Fate for Scene over the Howl, Eye of Ophidia. Oops. And then if it is the Lumina Boltyn, and once again, you'll have to scout this because you can't just guess, but if it is the Lumina Boltyn, you have an amazing matchup here, because you can just take Tunic, you can take the Pummels over the Pulpings, and same deal. Now you get to hopefully pummel a Command and Conquer and just destroy his ability to set up a Lumina. So that's something you really want to play towards if you know it's the Lumina deck. But you'll have to have scouted that. If you're having to guess which version it is, I would always guess it's Raiden first. And then as for the new Tales of Aria heroes, so I want to kind of discuss these all together, because as of now, I am definitely the most afraid of Oldhim. I think in my game so far, the only one I have dropped, the only time I've dropped a game to these heroes so far was a self-kill versus a Lexi, and then 2 games versus an Oldhim. Otherwise, my record against these heroes is really, really positive. And I do think Oldhim just poses the biggest threat to Levia in this meta, mostly because he gets to swing 4, and 4 is just such a awkward number for you to block. You're probably going to have to just tank it and just play through the Frostbite every turn, which does mess up a lot of your perfect Blood Rush turns. And his ability to make you top a card is also very hard to play around with Levia, because she's a hero that doesn't have the ability to just kind of have that extra card in hand. It doesn't really happen. She's so resource intensive because her stuff costs a lot, that you're going to play Dread Screamer into hopefully the Groveling Growl, but then he makes you top the Groveling Growl, and what can you do? It's not fun. It's really hard to play against, but that's the idea for having like the Remembrance and the Shadow Puppetries and stuff in there, is that you kind of eventually just want to wither his storm. But then Lexi, she's a ranger. She kind of falls apart once you start putting on a ton of pressure, and that happens like tenfold over in this deck, because you just have so much pressure with the Blood Rush and the Art of Wars and all that. So Lexi has really not been an issue. I've played against the Snapshot, Lightning, Ice all multiple times, and she just doesn't seem to have a lot of game versus Levia, because Levia can play through like 1 Frostbite, 2 Frostbites like relatively easily, but Lexi cannot play through your monumental damage because she just doesn't have great blocking equipment. So she has not been so hard. And then we've got Briar, and Briar has felt the best for Levia. Briar is very card intensive, very resource intensive, and yet her big turns are actually less than yours damage-wise. She is going to come out of it with more of the embodiments, but you actually don't mind that when you play into her, and she does block with some non-attacks and gets value out of the embodiments. That still negs how powerful her turn's going to be by quite a large margin. So Briar has really not felt that threatening as a Levia player. You can kind of just push through her damage, and the fact that most of her stuff doesn't really have relevant hit effects for kind of the mid-game pace of the game that you're trying to play towards. Ultimate late game, she's probably better than you, but it doesn't really get there. So then specifically versus Oldhim, it is not going to be an easy game, but there are things you can do. So like I mentioned, you want to take the Remembrance over one of the Ghostlies. You want to take the Shadow Puppetries over the... Where'd they go? Over the Pulpings. You might want to just not be at 60 cards and just add a little bit more threat to your deck, and just kind of add the pummels. You can try it. There's really... You got to just kind of try everything versus the hero. You can try just throwing in the unmovables as well, but you don't know what strategy they're going against. I think this core is kind of the best bet you have against that game plan. You also still want to take Carrion Husk over Findle Spring Tunic, because when they use like Channel Lake Frigid, Tunic is just unusable. And at least with the Carrion Husk plus your Scabskins, you can fully block an Endless Winter once. So that's pretty nice. He's just not an easy hero to beat with Levia, because he's going to make the game very dragged out, very long, and you are a hero that will eventually miss Blood Debt and perhaps kill yourself. I had a game versus Oldhim where I got fatigued out, never missed Blood Debt, but just ran out of cards in deck, and that was my lose condition. Of course, game lasts like 2 hours, so not super realistic in a tournament setting, but it's not something you can realistically beat if they just try to go hard fatigue. All right, then we've got the Lexi matchup. So kind of same thing. It depends. If they're like the more ice Lexi, then you don't want to run the Fate for Scenes. because if they're creating the Frostbite with the reveal, then Fate Foreseen's really hard to play. Same with like playing Unmovables into that. So if you don't really know what they're playing, I just wouldn't touch the build. I just go into it as is in the 60. But if you know that they're lightning as opposed to the ice, then you could go the Fate Foreseens instead of the Howls and the Eye. And that would probably be fine. But other than that, like, you're pretty solid just against the ice build in general. Alright, and then finally versus Briar. So like I said, Briar has felt very, very solid. That matchup just has not gone unfavorably yet. And I don't really side anything special. Of course, you have the Null Rune Hood. I am also taking the Fate Foreseens for the same reason that, like, you want a full block when possible to not give her those embodiment tokens. So the Fate Foreseens can be pretty big there. And of course, you know, once again, they are coming out instead of, where'd they go? The Howls. However, this is where it does change. I take out 2 Howls and I take out 1 Ghostly Visit instead of the Eye of Ophidia, because you do want more blues to be able to pitch to Null Rune Hood. So that's the one difference in siding versus Briar as compared to when I normally put in the Fate Foreseens. But really, that's it for the sideboarding tips. You know, there are potential better options than how I'm doing it, but my results have been pretty solid so far. I'll keep tweaking things in time for Nats. But I also wanted to address in this video kind of those other cards, the Levi's Majestic package and all that people ask me about, and why I'm not running them. So namely, I'm not running Mark the Beast anymore, and I'm not running this card because even in the aggro meta, it was questionable the fact that, like, yes, it blocked 3, but it banished itself, so it didn't really fill up your graveyard. It didn't, you know, turning off Blood Doubt on your opponent's turn doesn't really do anything. That said, in this meta as well, it doesn't fit this inevitability game plan that you want to be able to have against these slower decks, where you want to banish your graveyard. You want to actually clear out your graveyard so that you can do the Howl from Beyond loop. Mark the Beast doesn't do that. It doesn't help that strategy because it's not going to grave. It's not clearing the grave. It's just coming in for 6 and then closing the combat chain. It's when you close the combat chain. It's just not great with the idea that Howl is kind of your eventual win con. Instead, you want to run things like you saw the Hungering Slaughter Beast in my main deck. Those kind of took the slot over the Mark of the Beast because you're not afraid of banishing those 3 cards from graveyard. In fact, you actually want it as part of the current strategy. And then the other Shadow Brute Majestics that I'm not running are the Deep-Rooted Evil and the Shadow Blasmophet. So these cards, I really wish they were good. You know, in theory, it is cute that Shadow can, like, search out the Deep-Rooted Evil, and then it's, like, there as a toolbox option. But Shadow Blasmophet is just such a bad card. You have to draw then discard, so there's a randomness to it. The discarding effect lets you banish a Blood Debt card, but like something like Doomsday, which is your strongest one of in the deck, doesn't have Blood Debt, so that's not searchable. So what can you get? You can get, like, a Howl from Beyond, a Ghostly Visit, but those don't turn off Blood Debt. So really all you're getting is the Deep-Rooted Evil, because that can turn off Blood Debt. But this doesn't have Go Again, so you have to have played something previously to really make use of Deep-Rooted Evil that turn. Just feels like you have to put a lot of work into this card that's only really good early game. You can't block with it, and if it's in hand, you have to play it, and yet it really has no synergy with your larger turns. It's just to pull things out of your deck, and that's all you can do with it. Doesn't feel great, especially since the payoff card, Deep-Rooted Evil, the Big Majestic, isn't good. It costs 3, which feels really bad. If it costs 2, then you could do something like, you know, play an Unworldly Bellow, pitching a blue into the Deep-Rooted Evil. That would feel amazing. Instead, this costs 3, meaning this takes an entire blue card from your hand to play. So you have to have played another card previously to banish something, and probably pitched for that effect. So that's 3 cards total you have to use to get the Deep-Rooted Evil out of your banish zone and play it. And it's only a 6. and there's no hit effect. So it's just not doing anything remarkable for your deck. Like, I'd way rather Ghostly Visit with the ability to come in for 4 at no condition, only costing 1. That just sounds a lot better to me than the Deep-Rooted Evil here. So unfortunately, just not running the Shadowbrute Majestics, they don't make the cut. Maybe in the next supplemental set, we'll get some better options. Then the other thing is not running are the like Shadow Majestic package, all the playables from Banish here. So Mutated Mass is something that people have suggested over Ghostly Visit, but I'm going to counter that point saying that, you know, Mutated Mass doesn't block. And that's really the beauty of Ghostly Visit. It's a card that you can get the efficient 3 block from, and then when you just so happen to banish it from graveyard, you can cheekily come in for 4, and that feels really good. And it's not something like you have to really play for, it just happens because it's a 3 block that's going to get banished, and then you'll be able to eventually have an action point or a go again and swing in with Ghostly. Mutated Mass is a card you have to specifically be working to get into your banish, because it doesn't block, which means you have to have played it from hand or like discarded it somehow. But that's kind of counterintuitive because it is a blue, so if it's in hand you want to pitch it. But this card is like really weak to keep in your deck. So this just like doesn't work for me. Truth be told, I've never tried it over the Ghostly Visit, but I'm so happy with the Ghostly Visit with its block 3 ability that I don't know why I would ever play this over it. Kind of similar to Tome of Torment. This is a decent card, but how are you getting it into Banish? It doesn't block. To get it in Graveyard, you have to have either discarded it, which has no synergy with things because it's not a 6 power, or you have to have played it from hand. And this doesn't have Go again, so you have to have had extra action points to dump into the Tome, right? And to me that means you've rolled Scabskins probably more than I would recommend. So that's not something I personally want to be doing, is just rolling Scabskins just for a Tome draw. And on top of that, with like Ghostly Visit in my build, when I have that extra action point, I would love to chip in for 4 instead of just draw a card. This card just, once again, not great to me. If it blocked, then maybe it'd be worthwhile as just like, I'm going to block with this, and then it's like a toolbox option later when it's in Banish. But as of now, I just don't think it's a good card. And then we have Guardian of the Shadow Realm. This one actually is playable, but I think it's playable in a different meta. A meta where like Chane, Briar, Viserai are all nutso, and you need the ability to pitch to Null Rune and play defense reactions. This card is quite good. It costs 2, so when you pitch a blue, you do have the 1 floating. But there's just not a reason to really make use of that right now. I guess in theory, in the Frostbite meta, maybe you do have to play this over Unmovable if you're taking Unmovable versus Oldhim, but I don't really do that. Yeah, it's a decent card. It just doesn't fit what this build of Levia is trying to do with how aggressive she's being. Once again, the fact that like this action doesn't have Go again, meaning you have the extra action point somehow, just doesn't have a lot of synergy with Levia apart from rolling Scabskins a ton, which I just still wouldn't recommend. So these Majestics just, once again, don't quite work for her, in my opinion. Then this is a package that I am partial to, and I need more testing to really know if it's the right way to go about it. But the other option, other than like running Remembrance versus these really long game decks, would be to run kind of a combo package that has some late game massive play. The idea being with something like Energy Potion, Tear Limb from Limb, you can have an Energy Potion set up to eventually be able to play Tear Limb from Limb, cracking the Energy Potion or whatever order you want, to lead into a massive Tear Limb from Limb turn, and hopefully do something nuts. Present 12 on like a Dread Screamer into something else, and your opponent just can't block all of that. So in theory, this card is another like Shell Cracker. It is, but it requires some setup because I wouldn't want to be random with it. Pitch a blue, draw a discard. You don't really have control over what you're drawing, what you're discarding, and so you wouldn't really be sure how the rest of your turn is playing out. But with some setup, it could be good, right? Like you have the Dread Screamer in Arsenal, you've got the Energy Potion set up, you play the Tear Limb from Limb, it does its thing, then you're guaranteed to still have the Dread Screamer in Arsenal, and on and on. So this is something that's worth testing more of, but as of now I'm just sitting on the Remembrance because I can't make 2 deck slots free. But that's it, guys, for the Levia kind of deep dive into how to play certain matchups and like the deck tech for the sideboard and all that. So hopefully that was helpful. And anything that's been working for y'all, just please leave it in the comments. I'd love to know. Everyone's meta is very different, so like if you've got a ton of Kano players, let me know how that's going for you. But really, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll catch all my Groveling Ghouls later.